The aim of this talk is not so much to present a single case study, but more to introduce an approach to morphosyntactic change that can best be described as psycholinguistic or cognitive perspective on morphosyntactic change. Now, to some of you, the idea of doing psycholinguistic historical linguistics is a bit contradictory, because historical linguistics is the study of how languages change in the long term over many generations of many speakers, while psycholinguistics is concerned with the cognitive processes that take place when an individual speaker produces or processes language. So this is a short-term and individual instances take on things. However, the idea that the individual is involved in long-term language change is not a new idea. It's been proposed by many, many people before us. And an extreme case would be Hermann Paul, who in 1891 already said that the changes in language fulfill themselves in the individual. And indeed, since Hermann Paul, many people have asked questions along the lines of what are the psychological or cognitive processes that underlie language, and how do these individual processes, because they take place in the mind of the speaker, shape long-term aggregate level language change. And I'm sure that you're familiar with at least one of these concepts, probably all of them. These are all domain general cognitive processes, so these are all psycholinguistic concepts that are quite commonly applied in theories of language change, syntactic change. I personally come from a background of, say, functional cognitive linguistics. If I have to be really specific, but don't hold this against me, I'd say diachronic construction grammar. And especially in these approaches, you get a lot of reference to, in principle, psycholinguistic terms such as analogy, automatization, categorization, invited interesting, metaphor, metonymy, priming, and so on. Now, another concept which intrigues me personally very much, that's also quite commonly applied in studies of morphosyntactic change, is the concept of competition. And competition, we should define that as the struggle among alternative forms during the retrieval process. So that's very abstract. So I'll try to explain this with an example. So if you, as a speaker or as an individual, try to describe this scene depicted on the slide to someone involving an agent who sort of transmits an object to a receiver, there's two different ways of doing this. One of them would be the prepositional dative, the girl gave milk to the cat. Or there would be the double object construction, the girl gave the cat milk. So there's two different structures that can be used for describing roughly similarly to describe this particular scene. So those two forms are in competition. So competition is basically a co-activation in the speaker's mind of two similar ways or more similar ways of saying something, and at each given time of speaking, they will select one of the two ways of phrasing this. The reason it's called competition, which sounds a little bit hostile, but the metaphor is intentional, because the idea is that at each given time of speaking, there's only room for one form to be uttered, and that form is the winner of that competition, and basically language use is a constant struggle or fight between competing ways of phrasing a certain thing, and then speakers selecting one of them from the repertoire. Now, this sort of like constant and recurrent competition model that's taking place in individuals' minds is said to have certain effects on language change or language at large, because at every given time of speaking, a person makes a choice between forms, and if people would consistently start choosing for one of the two, there would be a situation where one form replaces another one, or speakers can sort of adjust what kind of changes they would make in what kind of context. And the outcome of that competition between alternative forms of saying something would be roughly the same as competition the concept would be in other domains. So biological competition between species over the same resources, political opponents competing over voters, or rivaling firms competing over customers. So the idea is that if two alternative structures, two ways of saying the same thing exist, they have overlapping functions, then eventually, if people keep making choices between them, there will be one of two outcomes. One of them would be there will be an eventual winner. So in that case, one form, form A, substitute another one, form B. Or something else happens and between one-time competitors, there develops a sort of division of labor. So speakers assign particular uses that are not too overlapping to the two forms. So there's a situation of differentiation or coexistence. I'm not saying that these are the only scenarios, but I'm saying that this is what, for instance, in Trogget and Troll sales, constructionalization and structural change, that's what's suggested when it comes to competition and language change. On the population level, if you look at a corpus and you look at situations of substitution and differentiation, you can see different frequency patterns. So in the hypothetical scenario of substitution, what you get is a alternative B, which becomes gradually more frequent at the cost of variant A. And the other scenario on the right side is one of retention or differentiation, where variant A and B continue to be used alongside each other at a distribution of roughly 50-50. Just to show you that I'm not making this up, this is a situation of the dative alternation, so whether you use a prepositional dative or a double object construction. In the Archer corpus, I took this graph from a paper by Eva. She took some of the data from a paper by Christoph Volketal, so collaboration here. In the Archer corpus, so the early to late modern period that's included in that corpus, what you see is that there's a stable proportion of prepositional datives and double object constructions, around roughly 60-40. That's kind of what you see. And many people have studied what the particular context and uses are that determine whether you would use a prepositional dative or a double object. So there seems to be like a nice semantic motivation or a functional motivation behind having two forms of saying roughly the same thing. Which is multifactorial as well, but I'm sure Eva can tell you a lot more about that. Okay, what's the problem with differentiation? Well, a lot of people have studied this, particularly in diachronic construction grammar, but they all did it using language as an abstract object that is basically a pool of speakers. The problem is that competition is something that inherently takes place in an individual's mind, right? So you're doing something with a constructed individual, actually, if you do that on the corpus level. Why is this a problem? Well, suppose that you have like a 50-50 distribution between variant A and B. So this would be the mean of what everyone does in that corpus over time. Ideally, everyone is scattered around that mean. So everyone alternates between two forms, and they do it roughly, I mean, it shouldn't be exactly on the mean, but somewhere around it. Less ideally, you'll find that not everyone steps in line. So there's people that misbehave and don't alternate at all. And worst case scenario, everyone's out of line. So if you talk about like semantic divisions of labor, cognitive motivations to use one form or the other, in the latter case you're talking about nothing because it's just an artifact of your corpus. So it's a problem, I recognize. So the moral of the story is we should devote more attention to the individual. We should learn from historical social linguists, I think, because they have already done a lot of interesting work looking at grammars of individuals and see how they relate to grammars of a population. I don't know why exactly this hasn't been adopted more in, say, construction grammar or other sort of functional cognitive approaches to language change. I'm assuming it is because data sets for individuals tends to be very, very limited, so there's not a lot of quantitative analysis that you can do with that. And I know I sure love quantitative analysis, so that's the reason why I haven't done it before. Okay. However, in recent years, and I'm actually really happy that Eva started talking about this evolutionary modeling, because this particular approach is actually methodologically innovative, and it pays attention to how individual behavior relates to population level changes. But also in general, resources have become much bigger, so new corpora have been digitized. So there's a lot more to work with, and people have started looking into the idea of doing historical cognitive linguistics. Most recently, I'm aware of a special issue in English language and linguistics edited by Alexander Bers and Thomas Hofmann, basically setting out, or it's a collection of papers that set out methodologies to do historical psycholinguistics, let's call it. So can you use psycholinguistic methodologies in historical data? Because surely you can't travel back in time and make a 17th century person fill in your questionnaire. No, you're absolutely right. However, you can add some ingredients of psycholinguistic methodologies to your corpus data. So you can use corpus data and treat it as if it was an experimental questionnaire. And there's a paper by Peter Petré who sets out how to make a mirror set methodology with lots of corpus data so that it approximates a fill-in-the-blank exercise questionnaire type thing. So in a nutshell, what Peter did was compare uses of the progressive in its earliest stages to the simple present. And there's always an example. The verb is kept stable, so think of this as a fill-in-the-blank exercise. You get a sentence, and then it says use the correct tense of the verb using the verb delight, for instance, or go. So you get paired sets of whither art thou going with why go you, and so on. So this has been applied to corpus data from a number of individuals, 10 individuals born in the 17th century, 16th century, 17th century? 17th century? So basically this is kind of the idea. So you have to have, the verb needs to be kept stable, then you make a mirror set of phrases or sentences for individuals, and then you check whether there are certain cues that indicate that one form or the other is used in other types of contexts, so whether there are other motivations for using one or the other. Speeding this up a little bit, okay. So what Peter found is that there's some innovative use of the progressive for each of these individuals, so they're all consistent with the general trend. And it seems to be that speaker involvement plays a role here. So if the speaker is very involved, being emphatic, or whether they want to sort of, again, emphasize that something is taking a long time, they would go for the progressive. Peter doesn't do a lot of elaborate statistic with this, but there's also other ways of checking how individuals relate to, say, the population level or the intercept. Have to go over this really quickly, but do ask me about this if you want to know more. But you can use a generalized linear mixed effect model with author put into it as a random effect. So what you get is you have a binomial output, so one variant or the other. You get a number of predictors or fixed effects that tell you whether something plays a significant role in the choice making. And then you add author to it as a random variable so that any kind of variation that can't be accounted for will be adjusted to basically will be accounted for. I'll talk about that if you want to. The only thing I wanted to point out here is that if you add author as a random effect, it's basically just adjustment, so there's not a predictor in the model. And this is taken from a paper by Gries and Hilbert, who at the end mentioned that, okay, well, if you plot all of them and you look at the most deviant cases, then we should actually start looking into these particular cases, because these people are so peculiar that there must be something odd going on. They don't do it, but they do mention, like, oh, peculiar is interesting, and I have to say, I completely agree. Because peculiar people might actually be more frequent than you would expect. So people can be consistently progressive, consistently conservative, even when it comes to abstract syntactic patterns. If you do an actual questionnaire, there might be someone who just doesn't alternate, just always picks one variant. So the question I was interested in is, what do we do with these peculiar people? Are they worth discarding, or should we pay a closer look to what they're actually doing? I did a really small case study on the gerund alternation, which is something I've worked on quite a lot. So in the first example, in eating of the forbidden fruit, this is a noun phrase. It follows a preposition, eating the forbidden fruit. And the structure of it is clausal. You have an ing form and it's followed by a direct object. And as such, it's different from structure B. I never disobey my father in anything but in eating of green gooseberries. So again, same distribution. In follows preposition in. But the structure of it is nominal. The direct object is expressed periphrastically by means of an off phrase. Okay, so verbal gerund, nominal gerund, keep that in mind. Lots of work has been done on how the verbal gerund started to replace the nominal gerund, because it's shorter, it's more syntactically flexible. It also seems to go gradually, so it starts in prepositional context and then spreads to core syntactic contexts. Then a little more recently, I've been arguing that it's actually not a case of replacement, it's actually a case of differentiation. But I've talked about this so much, I don't want to, I'll skip that. For this particular case, I was interested in seeing, like, okay, all these things that I've been studying on the population level, how does that relate to the individuals in the pen corpus? So I looked at 2 periods of early modern English, 2 periods of late modern English, and I took all the nominal gerunds and verbal gerunds, so these are the absolute frequencies of gerunds in each particular time period, the total number of authors, the percentage of authors that actually alternates, that uses both side by side, the percentage of authors that don't alternate, and whether they alternate using solely verbal gerunds or solely nominal gerunds. And especially the first late modern period is interesting because, as you can see, 35% of the population doesn't engage in the alternation. What does that mean, for my study? Not a lot, because if I skip through these slides, you'll see that it doesn't really change much whether I include them. The general trend stays the same. But it does reveal some things that I find interesting and worth pursuing. So one of the things you might notice is that, the population becomes more consistent as time progresses. So while people are sort of all over the place in terms of how often they use nominal gerunds versus verbal gerunds, consistency becomes, basically the error bars indicate that the population becomes more consistent. So that's one thing. Second thing is that if you look at the fraction of people that don't alternate, is that in the beginning the number of alternators sort of linearly increases and then it drops again. Which is interesting, because this is indicative of a replacement process, but then it reaches a certain threshold, and then all of a sudden everyone starts, or the majority starts alternating again. So that's definitely worth pursuing in a larger corpus, I think. I've done some more digging. So I decided, okay, there's lots of things to do here, and I became more interested in this idea of looking at individual grammars. And some very good friends who would happen also to be colleagues of mine developed a corpus called EMMA, Early Modern Multilingual Authors. It's a sample of 50 writers from the 17th century, or born in the 17th century, all from the London-based elite, so it's not great for social linguistic research because there's not a lot of variation there. So the vast majority is men. And they're from 5 different generations. Just some background information on the corpus. It's not finished yet, but when it is, you should use it. So what did I do? Well, the corpus is not part of speech tag, it's not parsed, so I used a regular expression to find all ing forms for generation 1 and generation 2, just to give you an idea of the vast size of this. I have an Excel file with 120,000 tokens of ing forms. This includes nominal gerunds, verbal gerunds, but also present participles, whether they're used adverbially, attributively, as progressives, prepositions such as according to, lexicalized ing nominals, building, painting, and nouns of all sorts. Something, anything, evening, string. The last group is not very interesting, but all of these, from a construction grammar perspective, all of these forms can actually interact. So I just decided to take them into account. I did that for 3 people so far. There's John Dryden, there's George Fox, and there's Thomas Pearce. I couldn't find a picture of Thomas Pearce, so it's about 170 nominal gerunds in John Dryden's repertoire, 610. So the numbers are beautiful. I think there's a lot of things that you can already say with this. Just quickly, very exploratively, what's nice is that if you just plot for each author in terms of their lifespan, how they use nominal and verbal gerunds proportionally, you can already see that there's some interesting differences between them in terms of how consistently or inconsistently, in the case of George Fox, they deal with gerunds. Also, the trends in lifespan in terms of how they deal with these variants are very different. So I did a really simple logistic regression. What this indicates is that for John Dryden, there appears to be a very small yet significant increase of how often they use verbal gerunds across the lifespan. George Fox and Thomas Pearce, there's no significant results there, but if anything, they're stable or even decreasing slightly. So they're different in that respect, and they also appear to be doing different things than what the eventual outcome of the change is, because that's what should be like John Dryden's. What else is this interesting for? Well, I think there's some things that we've been talking about in say diachronic construction grammar, but also just more generally functional approaches to language, and that is that there's certain psycholinguistic factors at play in how people use structures. And I think what the data is indicating so far is that you have a sort of long-distance priming effect. So in terms of how often these people use participles, which have a clause-like structure, as in example 3, can I love him already loving you? That appears to be correlated with how often they use verbal gerunds rather than nominal ones. So basically, whether you're able to assign a clausal structure to your gerund, despite the fact that it is a noun phrase and should pattern like other nouns. It's been mentioned several times by many people that there's no doubt that there's influence between, that these structures have influenced each other, that there's analogical attraction between them, but it's very hard to say which direction it went in, what's what. So this is actually kind of nice because you have a repertoire by a particular speaker and you can actually see whether there's correlations between how often they use the one or the other, and it does seem to be that the people that use verbal gerunds more often also use participles very, very frequently, and it decreases gradually. So if you could continue this for the entire set, that would be fantastic. So just to conclude super fast, I think my case study, but also further reflections I've done since then, suggest 2 action points for the historical cognitive linguist. First of all, historical linguists interested in revealing cognitive motivations behind linguistic alternations should more often adopt an approach that compares and contrasts aggregate level with individual level findings. Statistical models allow us to control for deviations of the intercept by random variables. Second, don't just stop there. You could actually also devote some attention to these peculiar individuals, see what that tells you. Not just because reporting on the fraction of non-alternators can tell you something about the development, but also that having studies of individual grammars could have some use to other types of linguistics beyond what you're doing. And that's everything I needed to say. So the idea is just that we have to devote more attention to the I in team.